Okay, so I'm gonna start talking about the second part of the data wrangling, normalization, and pre-processing of text, which is a follow-up of the talk given by Professor Picon 2 weeks ago, in which he expressed the deep learning methods that are used to process the signal. So clinical encephalography, or EEGs, as I'm going to call it from now on, is known to be the most important investigation in the diagnosis and management of epilepsies. An EEG records the electrical activity along the scalp and measures spontaneous electric activity of the brain. And for that, it is the main test for brain-related illnesses. In my talk, I'm going to show how, along with the EEG signals, we are processing the EEG reports, which are documenting the interpretation of these signals. So I'm going to show the kinds of methods that are used in order to process the clinical text in the EEG reports. So data wrangling is defined as the process of mapping data from an unstructured format, in this case the narratives of the EEG reports, to another format that enables automatic processing. And in this talk today, we're going to see how that format is basically a very complex annotation schema that enables us to do two kinds of processing. One, to organize the information in a complex probabilistic graph that would enable probabilistic inference, and the other one, on which I'm going to focus more, is in representing these EEG reports and the signals into multi-modal index that would enable us to perform identification of patient cohorts. So the ability to process the narratives in electronic medical records, which are now collected in every hospital in the country, would also give rise to the identification of a staggering wealth of biomedical knowledge. This knowledge will be inferred not only from the unstructured text, but also from many measurements such as vital signs or multi-channel signal data, as in our case is provided by the EEG signals. So we believe that this information could be transformative if properly harnessed. So as I'm going to be focusing mostly on processing the clinical test, we're going to see that current state-of-the-art natural language processing need to be enhanced with deep learning methods that face the challenges which are posed by the complexity and the volume of big data repositories of medical records. So I'm going to show how combining the advantages of two kinds of learning, namely active and deep learning, we will be able to process a large collection of EEG reports and annotate with clinical concepts and their attributes, which will enable us to create an EEG-specific qualified medical knowledge graph, and also to be able to use that for medical inference, like estimations of likelihoods of the clinical correlations or interpretation of the EEG test, and also in the discovery of patient cohorts. Now, when we talk about clinical text mining, this has been done for many decades, and there's ample research that can be distinguished in mining the biomedical literature, for instance, trying to find medical concepts in medical journals, medical textbooks, and scholarly research reports, or in another case, mining the clinical notes, for instance, radiology reports, progress notes, surgical notes, or hospital discharge summaries. These two kinds of clinical text mining are quite different because the first one focuses on biomedical NLP that extracts genes or proteins or pathways and biomedical events and relations, which gives an opportunity for translational work in biomedical natural language processing. With other words, getting results from the biological domain into the clinical domain. When we perform clinical NLP, we're actually focusing on building profiles of individual patients by extracting a broad class of medical concepts and conditions. For instance, the diseases, the injuries, or the symptoms and signs, as well as responses like the diagnosis, procedures, treatments, and drugs. And the goal here is to improve patient care. So the talk of today will focus on clinical NLP processing. I want to point out another special case of performing clinical NLP, which is for aiding computerized clinical decision support. And there's an excellent article authored by Dr. Dina Demner-Fuchsner, Wendy Chapman, and Clement McDonald that is offering an excellent survey. The title of this article is "What Can Natural Language Processing Do for Clinical Decision Support?" Well, let's look what are the steps of clinical and classical natural language processing of electronic medical records. As we see, we first need to identify what are the medical concepts that we want to annotate or discover in the medical records. In addition, because these narratives in medical records are often using hedges, we need to identify the assertions. Are these medical concepts factual, or are they negated? Are they expressing some hypothesis? After we identify the medical concepts and infer the assertions, the next step is to discover the features that would enable us to recognize them automatically. The features are informing some classifiers that will be trained and will be able to annotate automatically the medical concepts in the records. The results of these classifiers also need to be evaluated, and the cycle continues. Well, there's very interesting work and excellent resources on discovering medical records and natural language processing. There was a challenge in 2010, for instance, that aimed at recognizing automatically in records medical problems, medical tests, and treatments. So we wanted to take advantage of this past work and understand that recognizing such concepts involve two decisions. First of all, you need to identify the boundaries of this concept. In other words, what is the first word in the narrative where the concept is mentioned, and what is the last word? And after you recognize the boundaries, well, what kind of medical concepts have we recognized? In other words, what's the type classification? Is it a problem? Is it a test? Or is it a treatment? So the problem is, and the challenges that we're facing when we need to annotate big data, is that this time we're having to annotate many more types. There are resources that perform wonderfully, for instance, CTAKes, that would identify in medical records any concept that is annotated in the Unified Medical Language System. However, there's not coverage for any kind of EEG-related medical concepts there, so we have to go and look at other annotations that we can provide for this specific type of records. As many more types of medical concepts will need to be discovered in big data, that would infer that we'll have to have a very large number of classifiers, and that poses an incredible challenge because those classifiers will need to have some optimal feature selection, and it is very difficult to do that throughout a large number of classifiers. So the solution comes from deep learning and active learning. And by combining deep learning and active learning, we're actually generating a multitask active deep learning paradigm that aims to perform concurrently multiple annotations of all the EEG activities and their attributes, or the EEG events, or the medical problems, medical tests, and medical treatments that are encountered in the EEG reports. Well, what are EEG activities? These are brain activities such as waves and patterns. And what are the EEG events? These are brain responses as direct result of a specific sensory, cognitive, or motor event. In addition, with the identification of every medical concept of these types, we want to identify their modality and polarity values. what are the possible values of modality. It's factual, possible, or proposed, which indicate whether that clinical concept is an actual finding, or is it a possible finding, or a finding that may be true at some point in time in the future. And polarity has a value of either positive or negative. On the lower hand side of the slide, you are seeing that basically the annotations that we are performing are of multiple types, and for instance, in the case of an annotation for an activity, EEG activity such as rhythm, we have a lot of attributes, like this is a rhythm with a frequency band of alpha, and it is located in both hemispheres, and it is recurring continuously, and the location is occipital, and the modality is factual, and the polarity is positive. So with this, I'm exemplifying the complexity of the many types and the many attributes that we need to annotate in a set of very large number of EEG reports. So what's in an EEG report? When an EEG report is created, it follows the American Clinical Neurophysiology Society guidelines for writing such reports. It has to start with a section on the clinical history, describing the patient age, gender, and the relevant medical conditions and medications. Then an introduction section is discussing the EEG technique or configuration, followed by a description of the notable waveforms, activities, patterns, or EEG events from the signal. Then a mandatory section is the impression, which is the interpretation whether the EEG indicates normal or abnormal brain activity, and a list of the contributing epileptiform phenomena. And it ends with a clinical correlation section, which relates the findings with the overall clinical patient picture. So when annotating a big data of EEG reports, we had to create a schema such that we could describe all the semantics of the EEG activities and events as they are discussed in the report. So the first question that we had to answer was, well, what medical concepts do we really need to annotate, and what are their types? We decided to annotate medical problems, treatments, and tests, as well as EEG activities and events. And you see here our first example. For instance, if in the clinical history we are reading recently seizure-free but with episodes of light flashing in her peripheral vision followed by blurry vision and headaches, we want to be able to annotate the fact that seizure is a medical problem, as well as episodes of light flashing in her peripheral vision is a medical problem. As you see, these problems or these medical concepts can be mentioned as a single word, seizure, or a sequence of words like in episodes of light flashing in her peripheral vision. In the following section, topomax is identified as a treatment, but when we go to the description of the record, we are seeing that sharply controlled delta activity is actually an EEG activity, so is spike complex. But around these activities, we have a lot of other attributes that are expressed, like the fact that the sharply controlled delta activity is frontally predominant and it is irregular. So we need to capture also these attributes of the EEG activities in our annotation schema. As we notice that the EEG activities are not mentioned always in continuous expressions, we decided to use a schema in which we will annotate the anchors of the EEG activities, and the attributes will be determined as follows. What kind of attributes we decided to capture? Well, we decided to capture a very large number of attributes. The most notable one is the morphology. The morphology represents the type or form of the EEG waves. You see here that on the right-hand side of the slide, I'm showing the semantic hierarchy of the values that express the morphology of the EEG activities. They are classified as rhythms. They may be transient. They may be a single wave, like for instance wicked spikes. They may be complex, and as complex waveforms. They may be spike and sharp wave complexes or sharp and slow wave complexes, but they can also express a large variety of patterns, like suppression or like periodic lateralized epileptiform discharges. The morphology is just one of the attributes, along with several others that describe the general attributes. We also have temporal attributes and spatial attributes that we want to annotate. The frequency band represents the second attribute that we annotate, that distinguishes whether the waveform is an alpha, beta, delta, or theta or gamma form. We also want to annotate whether this is in the background or not. And as general attributes, we also annotate separately the magnitude, which describes the amplitude of the EEG activity. Among the temporal attributes, we are annotating the recurrence, showing how often the EEG activity occurs, and the possible values are it's continuous, repeated, or if it is none, that means that it occurs only once. The EEG activities are also associated with a significant number of spatial attributes, and they are grouped in three categories. The first category is the dispersal attributes, which describe the spread of the activity over regions of the brain. It could be localized or generalized. The second type of spatial attributes are the hemisphere where it occurs, could be right, left, or both. And finally, in a finer spatial grain, the brain location, which has another number of attributes describing whether it's frontal or occipital and so forth. So as you see, we have a total of 16 attributes that are associated with each EEG activity, which makes for a very complex semantics of the annotation schema. So how would these annotations look like? In this slide, you see an example of the manual annotations of the EEG reports that we have performed to create training data for our deep learning architectures. In this example, you see two types of annotations. The blue annotations represent the boundaries. For instance, multiple sclerosis indicate that that is a mention of medical concepts. In red, you see the actual type of the medical concept. So here we see it's multiple sclerosis is a medical problem. It is having the modality of factual, and it is having the polarity of positive. But please note when we go into the introduction section how the annotations become more complex, because for instance, in the case of the EEG activities like spike and wave discharges, in red we see all these values of the various attributes that are associated with it that need to be annotated. Like the morphology is transient, it is a complex wave in the form of spike and slow wave complex with a frequency band of delta, with not in the background, with the magnitude normal, the recurrence is repeated, the dispersal is generalized. We don't have information about the hemisphere, but we have information about the location as being frontal, and the modality is factual, and the polarity is positive. I want to note that in this annotation, we're actually making sure that we're tackling two important text processing problems, namely the ambiguity and the economicity of text. Ambiguity means that we may have one annotation that may end up expressing different semantic points in the hierarchy. And economicity means that in this specific EEG report, there's no place where it's indicated that this is a frequency band of delta that we need to infer, because later on we're basically seeing that the notation is from 4 to 4.5 hertz. So you see it's a very complex annotation schema that tries to capture the wealth of semantic information that is described in the EEG report. So let's see how we can create some machine learning architectures that would enable us to automatically annotate a very large corpus of EEG reports following this schema. First of all, we need to pre-process the EEG reports because there's many very important resources for medical language processing out there. So we use the GENIA resources, which comprise a tagger for tokenization. Tokenization means identifying every word in the narrative. Lemmatization, which means every word is transformed into its base lemma form. The part of speech, which recognizes that this word is a noun and this word is a verb and so forth, as well as phrase chunking, which means how the words are grammatically sticking together in a phrase. We also use the widely popular resource, which is the Stanford Core NLP for detecting syntactic dependency parsing. In addition, because every token or word in the EEG reports were identified, we created Brown cluster features from the entire Temple University Hospital corpus. The Brown clustering is an unsupervised learning method that discovers hierarchical clusters of words based on the context in which they occur. We also made use of the Unified Medical Language System to create feature vector representations that capture the medical knowledge that is available from the system. Then we have decided on two groups of features. The first group will be used in the deep learning architectures that identify the EEG activity anchors as well as the boundaries of the EEG events, medical problems, medical tests, and medical treatments. We have decided on 7 different features. The first one would be the lemma of the token and the previous and the next tokens. The second feature is the part of speech of the current token and its previous and next token. The third feature is the phrase chunk in which the token belongs. The fourth one is the lemma of the current, previous, and next token. We made use of a feature that represents the Brown cluster in which the token is situated. Then the UMLS concept unique identifier for that token, and the title and the section of the EEG report where the token is observed. In order to detect the EEG concept type, the attributes, the many attributes of the EEG activities, as well as the EEG concept, modality, and polarity, we decided on another set of 9 features, which are listed here. The clinical concept mentioned, the lemmas of each token, the part of speech, the lemmas of the 3 tokens before and after, the title of the section, but this time also used syntactic dependency paths, the number of words between the clinical concept mentioned and the specific token, the number of hops in the syntactic dependency path, as well as the number of clinical concepts between the clinical concept mentioned and the token in question. So that corresponded to that block in the natural language processing cycle in which we had to decide on the features that best represent the clinical concept that we want to annotate in a vast resource of records. Okay, so once that we have the features, we have to go and decide on the deep learning architectures. 2 weeks ago, Professor Piccone discussed a lot about the art and the magic that is involved in deciding on the best architectures that you want to use. Deep learning is the preferred natural language, the preferred machine learning techniques that can be used in the face of very large collections of text, in our case a very big resource of EEG reports. So here I'm going to start discussing the first architectures that we use to identify the boundaries and to identify the anchors of the EEG activities. The boundaries were identified for the EEG events, the medical problems, the tests, and the treatments. So in order to decide the architecture that is best suited to be able to learn how to automatically identify these boundaries and anchors, we have decided to use 2 architectures, one for the EEG activity anchors and the second one for the boundaries of the other types of medical concepts that we were aiming to annotate. These architectures, as you see on the slide, are represented by stacked long short-term memory cells, and they are stacked because they are having several layers, and we represent it in this architecture as entries of the tokens. So you see T1, T2, T3, Tn corresponds to the tokens of every sentence in any section of the EEG report. The output of the architecture are these labels, B1 to Bn. One label Bi is associated with the token Ti. The label values are I or B. A label of B indicates that this word is the beginning of a mention of a clinical concept. A label of I indicates that this word or token is inside the mention of the clinical concept. And the label of O indicates that this word is outside of any kind of clinical concept that we want to annotate. So let's go a little bit in more detail on how this deep neural architecture actually work. So by considering each of the tokens in each sentence, we want to predict the labels that they should be associated with. Therefore, we have a vector representation of every token from the sentence. You might be asking yourself, what is in this vector representation? Every token is associated with all the features that we have decided we want to use. So the feature values for that specific token. And what is the output? There are these values for the labels in, out, or beginning of a medical concept. I want to know the fact that each of the long short-term memory cells in this architecture is also using a memory state that is shared throughout the network. For instance, on the first layer, the LSTM cell receives an input from the vector of the token. So let's take token number 2. That vector will be input to that LSTM cell, which also gets as input the memory from the previous LSTM cell and produces an output which becomes an input to the next layer, and so forth. So we have such 3 layers that make sure that they are propagating all the features from the current token as well as the previous tokens to the softmax layers that decide the labels that should be associated with every word. So we use these 3 labels, and on the softmax layer, we're actually producing a probability distribution of all the possible labels of values I, O, and B. And this is accomplished using a vector of all the probabilities of a label to be an I, or a label to be an O, or a label to be a B. Therefore, the softmax layer is predicting what is the highest probability of a label that should be associated with that token. So this architecture enables us to identify and to annotate the EEG activity anchors and the boundaries of all the EEG, all the other medical concepts. But we still need to understand what are the attributes associated with these EEG activities and what are the types of the other medical concepts, as well as what are their polarities and modalities. This is accomplished by developing 2 other deep learning architectures. So you see in this slide that we have one architecture that would identify all the attributes of these EEG activities, or the 16 ones that we have discussed before, as well as the modality and the polarity. The second architecture is identifying the type of medical concepts divided into medical problems or EEG events or treatments or tests, as well as the modality and the polarity. You can note that these architectures are very different because of the fact that this time we're using a deep rectified linear network, which is using itself 5 fully connected layers of rectified linear units. So why we decided on using this architecture? Why does it work very well? And how does it really work? The decision of using these fully connected layers of rectified linear units was based on the incredible properties that these units provide. So I'll call them ReLU from now on. So ReLUs are known that they allow for a very easy deep net configuration, but they also have a sparse representation that allows them to perform de facto internal feature selection. With other words, when you learn this multitask embedding in this architecture, you are actually learning selection of the optimal features in identifying each of the attributes of the EEG activities, or in identifying each of the types of medical concepts that you want to annotate. So these 16 attributes are identified by feeding this shared embedding into a separate software layer for each of the attributes. And the same thing happens for the two software layers of identifying the medical concept types and their modality and polarity. So instead of training tens of classifiers, we're actually having only 2 deep learning architectures that perform very accurate annotations on a very large set of EEG reports. And they do that with learning the optimal features that need to be selected. Well, as we develop these 2 types of deep learning architectures, we want to incorporate them in the active learning loop. The active learning loop starts with this vast collection of EEG reports on which manual annotations were performed, and I've shown you examples of how they look like. But those annotations become initial training data for the 2 types of deep learning architectures that we just presented. These architectures then are used to annotate the thousands and thousands of EEG reports automatically, and then we need to have some sampling methods to decide which of them we should present to a neurologist expert for validation and editing. And this enhances the initial training sessions, and they annotate the entire corpus again. I want to note here on the right-hand side that the active learning loop is the one in which you have an expert going and validating the results of the deep learning annotations and provides new retraining data. And in order of making the best use of the expert, you need to develop some sampling methods. And the sampling methods that we have developed are taking into account that we're making many types of annotations, hence we needed to combine a rank combination protocol that would combine the several single task active learning selections into one. For this, we developed a usefulness score for each unvalidated annotation from the EEG reports and calculated it with the kind of rank it would allow to have the highest usefulness to the neurologist experts. We also experimented with some Shannon entropy in developing these sampling methods. So the sampling methods enable the usage of the active learning, which would involve accepting and editing the annotations and then retraining the deep learning methods and evaluate the new system. How does it work? Well, on the left-hand side here, you see the learning curves of all the annotations. So if you take, for instance, the first 100 EEG reports that were annotated and evaluated, you see that, for instance, that the boundary detection very quickly improves we start from an F-score of 85%, and we very quickly go to about 90% only from a small set of 100 reports. The EEG anchors being more complicated, it is interesting to see that we start again from an F-score of around 86%. The quality decreases initially, but it increases after a very small set of annotations. The attributes, which were not expressed in the anchors and morphology, are showing the greatest increase. They are the most complex ones, and we start from a low score of around 67 F1 score, and we get to almost 75 F score in a very few number of annotations, which is also expressed by the activity attributes learning curve. Now, once that the EEG report annotations are being produced, what are we going to be able to do with them? We are looking at two possible applications. The first one is to create an EEG-specific qualified medical knowledge graph in which can be used for medical question answering as clinical decision support, as well as for various medical probabilistic inference problems, like learning the posterior distribution of clinical correlation given an EEG description. Alternatively, the EEG report annotations enable us to create a semantically rich index of clinical EEGs and also incorporate the EEG signal data in order to retrieve patient cohorts. So I'm going to focus on the second application now. The EEG report annotations would enable us to create this semantically rich index because for every medical concept that we automatically identify, we can generate a separate unique identifier. Along with the identifier, we'll generate the concept type. For instance, this is an alpha activity, or it is a sharp and slow wave. And if it is a concept that uses multiple terms, then each term would receive its own term ID. For the EEG activities, we'll also organize all the attributes and the terms that are used to express those attributes. That would generate what we call a medical concept dictionary. These medical concept dictionaries can also be associated with their IDs into a term dictionary, because in information retrieval, we generate term-based dictionaries. So every term ID that was found associated with every medical concept ID would be expressed in the term dictionary, and that's where we associate the polarity that we have discovered along with the concept in which the term was used. Anytime we have a positive polarity, will indicate what EEG report that term was found, in which section, in which position in the section, what was the concept, medical concept ID in which it appeared, and what was the actual concept and their modality. If it was a negated concept, that it will represent it with similar information, but in a different list. In information retrieval, we use dictionaries and also posting files. So now I'm going to put my information retrieval researcher hat on, and we'll discuss, well, how can we search for relevant patients, and how can we really be able to use this index in the best way. So we first need to create inverted tiered lists. So what are inverted tier lists? They make sure that every time when you find, for instance, a concept like a seizure, you'll be able to know all the EEG reports in which they are encountered. So we'll have tiered inverted lists for every positive polarity indication of seizure, as well as another set of inverted lists for every negative indication of a seizure, in which you see that we have the term dictionaries like seizure, but we'll also know that that specific term belongs to a medical concept ID, in this case, a medical problem that is encountered in some EEG report. But as you remember from 2 weeks ago, Dr. Picon showed that this EEG reports are associated with every EEG signal and their processing. So we like to be able to also use this other modality that shows the actual test, and we created some EEG signal fingerprints that are also linked into the tiered inverted lists that would enable us to search for the patients that we are interested in, as based on the criteria of the cohorts. The EEG fingerprints are also organized in a similarity hierarchy. So how does this work? Well, the EEG fingerprints are generated by taking into account that the EEG signal encodes a dense floating point matrix based on the number of electrode channels that were used, as well as the number of samples in the recording. So when we did one pass over all the EEG signals, we found that this requires an enormous amount of information. Just for one signal, we will need to have more than 400 gigabytes of information. Therefore, for the multimodal index, we have to consider a more compact representation of these EEG fingerprints. This compact representation was created by another deep learning architecture. So now you see a third exemplification of deep learning, in which all the EEG signals are processed in very short time. Instead of processing them in weeks and weeks, we are processing them in matters of hours, because we reduced the EEG signal from 20 megabytes to just a few hundred bytes. That was possible by using the recurrent neural network that you see on the slide, in which we consider that every EEG signal is actually a sequence of samples, such that for every sample, we'll learn how to predict the next sample. And this was made possible by using, again, the long short-term memory cells that would learn long-range interactions in the EEG signal. So the long short-term memory cells maintain and update an internal memory such that they can output the EEG fingerprint after they look at all the samples. So once that we have created this complex multimodal index, we can answer natural language queries that express the criteria for a patient cohort. For instance, if a neurologist would like to find a query of patients that take topiramate, Topomax with a diagnosis of headaches and an EEG demonstrating sharp wave spikes or spike polysky and wave activity, the deep learning methods that process the clinical text will be able to annotate this query and recognize that topiramate, Topomax are medicines, and that headache is a problem, and the EEG is a test, and sharp wave spikes and spike polysky are EEG activities. Once that the analysis of the query is being performed from the EEG cohort description, we'll be able to use two relevance models that take into account the term or the concept dictionary that we have discussed, as well as the inverted list to enable the recognition of patient cohorts. So we experimented with two cases. One case in which we used only the annotations on the clinical text, and another case in which we augmented those annotations with the index that considered the signal as well, therefore the multimodal index. And we were pleasantly surprised that this relevance model showed that the multimodal index produced the better cohorts. So in order for finding these cohorts, we had to develop relevance models. In information retrieval, there's this BM25 ranking function that enables you to find the most relevant documents or EEG reports that would match a certain query. If we are considering also the signal fingerprint, then we had to develop another relevance model in which we could look up the most similar EEG fingerprints for the top rank reports provided by the BM25 ranking function. So we asked then several neurologists to provide with patient cohort descriptions, which we call queries. And here you see 5 examples of descriptions that they all agreed that would be of high clinical interest for them. And then we passed those queries through our patient cohort retrieval system and asked them to evaluate the results. So for every patient cohort criteria, we identified the 10 most relevant EEG reports, and then we did a random sample of 10 other reports that were retrieved between the ranks of 11 and 100. Each neurologist was asked to judge whether each of the EEG reports was considered relevant. They would give a rank of 1 if the patient described in the report definitely belongs to the cohort they were looking for, and a 0 if the patient does not belong to that cohort. And then we use 3 measures that are widely accepted in the information retrieval community to evaluate the quality of the results. These measures are the mean average precision, the normalized discounted cumulative gain, and the precision at rank 10. And here are the results. So if we would have used only the clinical EEG reports with no processing of the medical concepts, then we would have obtained a precision of 10 at about 80%. And as you see the map, which we have defined, the mean average precision would be only about 52%. If we would have used some language models in which we would have tried to create a similarity based on statistical properties between the query and the EEG reports, actually the mean average precision would have been even worse. And as a third baseline, if we would have used just simple text processing, the median average precision would have been 46%. Therefore, in less than half of the cases, the patient would not have been relevant. Our multimodal patient retrieval system, which we call Mercury, obtained much better results because we were able first to introduce the medical concept dictionary. So we obtained average precision of 58 to 57%. When we also introduced the signals, this average precision jumped to 70%. But I also want to know this other metric, which is the precision at 10, which means the 10 most relevant patients. And please note that in the case when we use the signals as well as the processing of the EEG reports, we obtain a precision of 100%, meaning that the first 10 patients are always evaluated as should have belonged to the cohort. When we have used only the automatically produced annotations on the EEG report, the precision at 10 was 90%, meaning that out of 10 patients, 9 should have been in the cohort and 1 is incorrectly included in a relevant cohort. So, in summary, I hope that I have convinced you that using deep learning on big data can be transformative, because active learning can take advantage of these modern successful deep learning architectures and approaches to produce annotations, and in the case when adequate sampling mechanisms are considered in the active learning loop. Also, neural learning enables a large number of annotation tasks to be performed jointly and provides a very rich semantic information to be captured in a global manner across vast clinical resources. We believe that deep learning can play an important role because in data wrangling it's critical, because there's lack of annotated data and there's many applications which will not support the development of annotated big data resources. They are developed for a small number of reports and a small number of types of concepts that we aim to annotate. Annotations is just an enabler for many applications. For instance, searching through newly annotated data, we'll also have to consider all these modalities. Sometimes we have text, narratives, but we also might have other kinds of signals or images associated with them. And hence, the clinical information needs to be organized into a multi-modal index, which can be generated with novel deep learning representations. The annotations produced with deep learning in vast clinical data will enable the generation of probabilistic representations of medical knowledge, which will give a new impetus to probabilistic medical inference. I want to acknowledge the grant that made possible our research. This is research supported by the National Human Genome Research Institute of the National Institute of Health and the award number 1U01HG008464. This research wouldn't have been possible without the incredible corpus of EEG reports and signals from the Temple University Hospital. Any opinions are conclusions and recommendations are only the authors and do not reflect the views of National Science Foundation or National Institute of Health. And if you want to find more about me or you want to learn and read the papers that I have discussed here, please go to this URL that you see on this slide. And here are some papers that I touched on describing the methods here. The first paper that describes all these active deep learning architectures has been submitted to the Clinical Research Informatics at EMEA. The second paper was just presented in November at the annual symposium of EMEA. If you want to know more about the corpus, please go and visit the Temple University Hospital EEG data corpus, which was published in the Frontiers of Neuroscience. And if you want to find more about how natural language processing can be applied to medical question answering for clinical decision support, we had a paper this fall in the CIKM conference, which was awarded the Student Best Paper Award. And we also have an upcoming paper on using deep learning from EEG big data for inferring underspecified information in EEG reports. So I would be glad to take questions now.
So, hi, Dr. Harabagiu. Thank you so much for being with us here today. I mean, you know, you're taking time away from your day job as a professor, and we really appreciate it. This work is fascinating. It seems like it's very much related to your big data knowledge grant. I'm wondering what other applications do you see of this? Because certainly the methods that you've talked about and the usage of deep learning in all these different, in multiple ways for the same problem, you know, towards the same goal, but using it multiple times, seems to be a very novel way of doing things, but yet also very could be applicable in other types of applications, types of problems. What do you see doing next after this? What do you see as the next step?
Well, what I would be very interested is in using these methods and probably developing new methods to be able to do clinical decision support and being able to identify how all these annotations can be used to inform question answering methods that are trying to find similar cases in literature, especially as we have so many publications being generated on a monthly basis and could inform a clinical decision support. Another important application would be this creation of a very vast probabilistic knowledge base and sharing it with the community, especially the machine learning community that is in big need of having resources to apply for probabilistic inference and creating factor graphs that would be able to give us priors of all these clinical correlations and of similarities between patients. Another application that we have discussed with our friends at Temple University is the ability to detect in real time seizures And this kind of very complex probabilistic knowledge base will be able to inform very much these predictive methods that we could develop on the data that we annotate in any kind of corpus. This is not necessarily related to EEGs, any kind of corpus that would have any kind of clinical narratives and would have eventually any kind of other modality like images could be processed with these very same methods with a little extra work of tweaking the annotation schema to the specific problems that the corpus is covering.
I'm glad you mentioned that one of the next steps is doing the inference on here, because one of the questions online is about how you'll account for uncertainty. But in particular, how do you account for that uncertainty in the data as it's collected, or that is collected?
Exactly. So we know that this data is not perfect, so it may contain errors and it has a lot of uncertainty, definitely. So there are two ways that we have in mind. So the first way that we started tackling is try to infer the underspecified information. So there's a lot of clinical data that is not giving you the full picture. So there's a lot of underspecified things that are not discussed that you want to discover as well. The other aspect of it is that once that you have this probabilistic knowledge base, you'll be able to start using probabilistic inference on it to be able to deal with uncertainty. In the knowledge base that we're constructing, we are associating these modality values. We have more than these three that I have discussed here. We have several attributes which are values of uncertainty, like is this hypothetical, is this possible, is it associated with another patient, and so forth. And all those kind of uncertainty values coming from the inferences that are detected in the narratives are used in probabilistic inference to generate the most likely outcome that you are looking for from this very vast knowledge base.
Thank you. There's another question online or a couple of other questions really about what kinds of tools are you using in your research, and tools or data. So for example, are you using IBM Watson or other tools? Are you using PubMed Central's corpus as your data? If you could just say a little bit more about the types of things that have been helpful to you.
Okay, so that's an excellent question. So first of all, we are using clearly for question answering. We are not using Watson because I have a past work in question answering for about 20 years. I'm one of the authors of a book on question answering. So in my lab, there's a lot of expertise on building question answering systems. We believe we can do it better because we have our own tools of relevance, of natural language processing, and the ability to identify and pinpoint complex questions and their answers. So these are our own tools, and we actually want to share them with the research community. These tools are now upgraded with these deep learning methods. Some of them I have described here. The deep learning libraries that we have used were TensorFlow from Google. We experimented with several others, but we all settled on TensorFlow because we find that they are very reliable and very well documented. Also, in terms of other natural language processing method that we're using the Genia corpus. We make use of UMLS. We make use of the PubMed Central archive in order to tune the features that turn out to be most informative to our methods. And by the way, we would like to release quite soon a version of the patient cohort retrieval in such a way that anyone could build their own patient cohort on their own clinical data, and also to release this kind of multi-modal indexes that people can easily use in their research or experiments.
So thank you very much again. We're out of time, but I just wanted to say that on behalf of everybody online who is muted and can't talk, that we really do appreciate you coming and sharing a bit of your expertise here. And it was certainly fascinating to hear about the use of deep learning to automatically annotate the EEG reports and to retrieve relevant reports. So thank you.
Thank you, Michelle. Thank you for giving me the opportunity.
All right. Goodbye, y'all.